The wind had teeth that night, dragging its icy breath across the Wyoming flats and rattling every loose board of Calder Boone's cabin until it seemed the walls themselves shivered. Darkness pressed against the windows, heavy and unbroken, the kind of night where silence turned sharp enough to keep a man awake even when he wanted sleep to claim him. Calder lay stretched on his narrow cot, one arm behind his head, the other near the rifle he always kept close, his hat tipped low across his eyes, though they were far from closed. Sleep rarely came easy. Too many nights of listening for danger during the war had left him with a body tuned to wake at the smallest sound. He'd thought the storm outside would be the only companion to his solitude, but that night something else moved beyond the brittle cry of the wind. It was faint at first, a groan of wood on the porch, the hesitant press of weight where no weight should have been. Calder's pulse leapt, his muscles coiled like wire. He had spent too long alone not to know the difference between wind and footsteps. When the latch whispered against the door, he sat upright, rifle in hand, heart thundering in his chest. The door eased open with the patience of desperation, not the boldness of an intruder, and the cold slipped inside like an unwelcome ghost. He struck a match, flame spitting light across the cabin's shadows. For a moment he thought the room empty, but then he heard the cot behind him give the slightest shift, the weight of another body pressing against the blankets. His breath froze in his throat. There, curled on the far edge, as if she had always belonged to the darkness, was a woman. Young, bronze-skinned, her black hair tangled around her face, her bare feet raw and cracked from miles of running. Her dress was torn, her ankles swollen, and dirt streaked her skin like war paint. She looked more like a spirit risen from the storm than a living soul. Yet her eyes, dark, wide, unflinching, met his without plea, without lie, just silence, just waiting. And in that silence, something in him faltered. Every instinct told him to drag her out into the cold, to protect the fragile boundaries of his solitude. But the sight of her wounds, the trembling in her hands as she clutched the blanket, cut through the hard edges of his resolve. He tossed her another wool cover, gruffly muttering she should keep her distance. She caught it slowly, fingers trembling, and pulled it tight around herself. The cabin returned to stillness, save for her uneven breathing and the beat of his own heart, loud as a drum in the small space. He sat by the lantern for hours, rifle across his knees, watching the fireless stove and listening. She did not speak, nor did he. Yet the quiet was no longer the hollow quiet of loneliness. It was something else, something heavier and strangely alive. He could not name it, but he felt it pressing close, as steady as the storm outside. When at last he lay back down, the rifle within reach, his senses clung to every breath she drew, as though those small sounds might mean more than the entire roar of the wind. The grey light of morning seeped through the cracks, revealing she was still there, huddled under the blanket, her hair a black tangle across her face. Calder brewed coffee, the familiar hiss of water grounding him, but his eyes never strayed far from her. When she stirred and met his gaze, alert but unafraid, the first fragile thread of something unspoken stretched between them. It was not safety, not yet, but it was the beginning of a story neither of them had expected to write in the heart of winter's silence. And as the storm outside yielded to a brittle dawn, Calder realized that for the first time in years his solitude had been broken not by danger alone, but by the presence of someone whose very breathing reshaped the air around him. The world outside remained cruel and cold, yet in that cabin the seed of something warmer stirred. If this story stirs something healing inside your heart, I invite you to linger with me. Like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for the next chapter of this unexpected journey. Together, let's walk further into the quiet wilderness where love begins, like fire hidden in the frost. The morning carried them forward into the fragile rhythm of survival, where each glance and each silence would mean more than words, and where trust, though hesitant, would be forged by necessity. It was not the end of the storm, but the first step toward a bond that neither of them yet understood, and it was in that fragile step that their story truly began. The fire had burned low, leaving the cabin cloaked in amber shadows, the scent of coffee lingering in the air like a quiet reassurance. Calder set 2 cups on the table, one close to the cot where she sat wrapped in wool. He had brewed it stronger than usual, as if heat and bitterness might anchor them both in something familiar. She watched him with sharp eyes, her body still taut as a bowstring, though she reached for the tin cup with a hesitant hand. The steam touched her face, softening the hard lines exhaustion had carved there. When she drank, her lips trembled against the rim, but she did not look away from him. Calder leaned back in his chair, the rifle resting against the wall behind him. He had spent years believing silence was easier than speech, but her quiet was different. It was not the silence of loneliness, it was the silence of survival, as though every word had to be weighed before release. When she finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. "Nia." The sound of it seemed to settle in the cabin like a small flame refusing to die out. He nodded once, answering with his own name. She repeated it softly, testing the weight of it on her tongue, and for the first time her gaze flickered not with suspicion, but with something like recognition. As the morning stretched, Calder worked in silence, tending the stove, mending tack, cutting wood just beyond the door. Each time he returned, she was still there, sometimes near the fire, sometimes bent over his mending kit, her stitches uneven but steady. Her movements were clumsy, yet careful, as if reclaiming fragments of dignity stolen by the road behind her. He found himself pausing at the doorway, watching her shoulders bend to the rhythm of needle and thread. The torn bodice of her dress closed slowly under her hand, no longer a mark of desperation, but of persistence, of healing. He asked where she came from. Her answer was one word, spoken with the weight of entire lifetimes: south. When he pressed further, anyone following, she gave only a single nod, her needle pausing mid-air. That was enough. Trouble had already etched itself into her skin, into the rawness of her feet, into the haunted set of her jaw. Still, Calder did not send her away. He told her she could stay for now, so long as she listened when danger came. She met his eyes then, steady, and nodded once. That was the first fragile pact between them. That night, Calder gave her the cot, spreading his own bedding on the floor near the door. His body remained tuned to every whisper of the wind, every sigh of the logs in the stove, every small shift of her breathing. He told himself he didn't trust her yet, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't put her back into the storm. As the hours wore on, the hollow ache that had haunted his winters eased just enough for him to close his eyes without dread. Morning came crisp and silver, frost edging the windows. Calder found her already awake, her dark hair loosely braided, her shoulders wrapped in the blanket like armor. She moved slower than him, limping when she crossed to the table, but her gaze no longer darted like a hunted animal's. He poured water into the basin, told her she could use it, and she obeyed in quiet ritual, washing away dirt until bronze skin emerged beneath. The bruises at her collarbone were fading now, yellowing like old paint. He busied himself with the fire, yet the image of her bent over the basin stayed in his mind, imprinting itself with quiet insistence. As days unfolded, she began to rise before him, sweeping the floor with his old broom, stacking kindling neatly by the stove, arranging his few tools with an order that was not his, but somehow fit. Each act was small, but in the hush of the cabin they built into something larger, the slow weaving of belonging. Calder watched her work with the patience of a man unused to company, but unwilling to disturb it. She was no longer simply surviving. She was shaping the silence into something gentler, something almost healing. When he saddled his horse to check the pasture, he left her behind with the door barred, half expecting her to vanish the moment his back was turned. But when he returned, she was still there, lantern lit, fire fed, beans warming on the stove. She unbolted the door at his voice, stepping aside with quiet certainty as though she had been waiting all along. The meal they shared was sparse, but they passed bread and salt without hesitation. It was the first evening in years that did not end in hollow silence, but in the steady rhythm of two people breathing the same air without fear. Later, when he cleaned his rifle at the table, she sat cross-legged on the floor, watching with calm attentiveness. Her voice broke the stillness once more, low and uncertain. "Men come?" His answer was steady. "Not today." She nodded, and in the glow of the lantern, her shoulders eased for the first time. She pulled the blanket closer and sat near the fire, her lips curving with the faintest hint of a smile, as if to remind him that even in danger, warmth could still be chosen. And so the days stretched, each one a fragile thread binding them closer. He gave her shelter. She gave him presence. He guarded the cabin with his rifle. She filled its silence with quiet labor. What began as intrusion was becoming something else entirely. Calder did not name it yet, but when night fell and he lay awake listening to the soft cadence of her breathing, he knew the emptiness had begun to shift. The storm outside would return, and so would the riders on the horizon, but for now the cabin was not hollow. It carried the echo of her name, the weight of her gaze, and the fragile warmth of trust forming between two souls who had both walked too long alone. And in that fragile warmth, like embers hidden beneath ash, something larger was preparing to burn. The days began to fold into one another, marked not by loneliness as they once had been, but by the quiet rhythm of two people learning how to share the same fragile space. Calder woke early as always, the instinct of years spent in vigilance refusing to fade. But now his first glance was no longer toward the empty horizon. It was toward the cot, where Naya often stirred before the sun had fully risen, her dark hair tangled across the pillow, her breathing soft but steady. He found himself listening for that sound as much as he once listened for danger, and in that steady rhythm something inside him eased. She had begun to heal. The swelling in her ankle had lessened, the cuts on her feet closing under the salve and bandages he applied with steady, careful hands. At first she would not meet his eyes when he touched her, but over time her gaze began to linger, unspoken trust gathering between them like the slow layering of snow. Each morning he checked her wounds, and each time she allowed him without resistance, until the act became not duty but ritual, a quiet exchange of care that warmed the silence between them. When she could walk more freely, she refused to sit idle. She swept the floor until the boards gleamed in the lantern light, stacked wood by the stove, and mended his torn shirts with clumsy stitches that still held. Calder watched her from the doorway one afternoon, her head bent low over his shirt sleeve, her fingers working stubbornly against the needle's bite. The firelight caught on her cheek, softening the strong lines of her face, and something stirred in him that had nothing to do with caution or duty. He nearly smiled when she lifted the seam and frowned at its unevenness. When he told her it would hold, the brief curve of her lips in response was enough to lodge itself in his chest like an ember refusing to die. Meals became less a necessity and more a ritual of companionship. They sat opposite one another at the small table, passing the bread, the salt, the tin cups of coffee. She ate slowly at first, uncertain, but as days turned, she ate with quiet assurance, no longer waiting for him to take it away. One evening, when he set a second bowl in front of her without words, she murmured his name, not questioning, not testing, simply affirming his presence. That single word, spoken with quiet certainty, felt warmer than the fire between them. Sometimes she followed him outside, limping at first, then walking steadier as the land stretched wide before them. He taught her how to ride slow, lifting her carefully onto the horse and feeling the light hold of her fingers against the back of his coat. She said little, but her silence was not emptiness. It was watchful, steady, and somehow grounding. When she scanned the horizon with eyes sharpened by survival, Calder realized he no longer carried the weight of vigilance alone. Nights carried their own kind of quiet, heavier but no longer suffocating. He still laid his rifle within reach, but when he spread his bedroll on the floor and heard her breathing above him, it was no longer the sound of a stranger. It was the sound of belonging beginning to take root. The fire crackled, her silhouette curled beneath the blanket, and for the first time in years, Calder did not feel the cabin pressing in around him. It felt lived in, softened by the presence of another soul. There were moments when the old wariness threatened to return, the sight of her bruises, the knowledge that men might still come searching. Yet those shadows grew weaker against the quiet light she brought into the room. She had begun to hum softly while she worked, low melodies without words that threaded through the air like strands of healing. He never asked her to stop. Instead, he found himself working slower when she sang, letting the sound settle into the marrow of the silence he had carried for too long. One evening, as he sat sharpening his knife by the fire, he asked without looking up if she ever thought of leaving. The pause stretched long, but when she answered, her voice was steady. No one left. The simplicity of the words cut deeper than anything else she had said. It told him of a life stripped bare, of a family lost to violence or distance, of why she had stumbled into his cabin with nothing but desperation. Calder set the knife aside then, his chest tightening with something that was not pity, but recognition. He too had known loss that gnawed like hunger, silence that could bury a man whole. In that moment, the gulf between them narrowed into something fragile but undeniable. The cabin changed with her presence. She began to place things in quiet order, his tools, his clothes, the dishes stacked neatly by the basin. Each gesture whispered of permanence, as though she was not merely surviving here, but beginning to claim the space as her own. Calder noticed, though he said nothing. The sight of her moving with ease, no longer as a guest, but as someone who belonged, planted a warmth in him that even the sharp winds outside could not touch. When night came again, she no longer curled to the farthest edge of the cot. She lingered near the fire until her eyes grew heavy, then lay down, leaving less distance than before. Calder lay awake listening, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with hers, and he realized he no longer dreaded the silence of night. Instead, he waited for it, because in that silence her breathing anchored him more than any rifle at his side. The winter outside remained unyielding, the sky still heavy with storm, but within those cabin walls a shift had begun. It was subtle, delicate as frost on glass, but it was there, the weaving of trust, the tender ache of companionship, the first fragile threads of love born not in words, but in the healing weight of shared quiet. And as Calder closed his eyes, the last thought before sleep claimed him was not of danger, nor of solitude, but of her presence, steady, unspoken, and impossibly alive. The thaw came slowly, each morning still sharp with frost, each night heavy with wind, yet inside the cabin something softer was growing. Calder had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, Nia moving with unhurried grace as she swept, stacked kindling, or stitched another patch into his worn shirt. She no longer glanced over her shoulder with fear when he entered the room. Instead, her gaze lifted to meet his, steady and calm, as if she had begun to recognize that his silence carried no threat. Her wounds had healed enough that she could walk the yard without limping, though he still reminded her to be careful. She followed him once to the fence line, her steps cautious at first, then steadier as the open plains stretched before her. The horizon seemed endless, pale sky folding into earth, and for a moment she stood still, breathing it in as though it were the first taste of freedom after too much shadow. Calder watched her from the corner of his eye, the cold air biting his lungs, and realized he had not shared this land with anyone in years. To see it reflected in her eyes, wide and searching, gave it new meaning. And when the chores were done, they returned to the warmth of the cabin, where the fire hummed softly in the stove. She brushed out her hair in the glow of the flames, long dark strands spilling over her shoulders, damp from the basin where she had washed. Calder sat nearby, cleaning his revolver, though his eyes drifted more often than he intended. Her presence softened the edges of the room, as if the cabin itself leaned toward her, eager to be more than just shelter. Evenings unfolded into a rhythm that felt like healing. They ate together at the small table, not always speaking, but sharing the space with a quiet that no longer felt heavy. Sometimes she would hum, her voice low and soothing, threading through the air like smoke. Calder listened, letting the sound work its way past the hardened places in him. When the fire dimmed, she curled into the cot, no longer retreating to its farthest edge. Each night the distance between them lessened, and though neither spoke of it, both felt the change. One evening, after returning from the northern fence, Calder found the door barred just as he had told her. She unlatched it at his voice and stepped aside, the fire already burning, beans warming in the pot. The small details struck him. The way she had lit the lantern without waiting for him. the way she moved with ease, as if the cabin had accepted her as its keeper. They ate together, and afterward, as he sharpened his knife, she asked him softly if the men would come again. The words trembled, but her eyes did not. Calder answered steady, promising her they would be ready if they did. For the first time since she arrived, her lips curved in something like a smile. It was faint, fragile, but enough to shift the air between them. Later that night, when she lay down, she did not curl away but closer, leaving only a breath of space. Calder lay awake listening to the storm outside, his arm resting near enough to feel the warmth of her shoulder. He did not move, did not break the fragile trust forming there. Instead, he let it settle inside him, filling places long hollowed by silence. The days wove on, each one a thread binding them closer. Nia's hands grew steadier on the needle, her stitches neater. She laughed once, softly, when the thread tangled, and Calder found himself holding that sound long after it faded, as though it carried more weight than any memory of war or solitude. She began to speak more, short words at first, then sentences, stories of her mother teaching her to sew, fragments of a family she had lost. Calder listened in stillness, never pressing, but carrying each word like it mattered more than the storm outside. At dusk, when the sky burned with red and the cattle huddled near the fence, they sat together by the fire. She braided her hair with slow, careful fingers while he mended the strap of his saddle. Their movements were simple, yet the air between them felt charged, like the hush before a storm. When her braid slipped loose and her hair spilled down her back, Calder caught himself staring too long. She noticed, but instead of pulling away, she simply lowered her gaze and continued, her lips curving faintly, as if she understood more than she said. That night, she did not wait for him to spread his bedroll on the floor. She sat on the cot and left space beside her, a quiet invitation. Calder hesitated only a moment before crossing the room. He lay down carefully, leaving distance, but the space felt alive, charged with unspoken promise. In the glow of the dying fire, she whispered, "You safe?" The words brushed against him like a balm, and when he turned his head, her eyes were waiting. He answered simply, "You too." Sleep came easier that night, deeper, free from ghosts of war. When he woke before dawn, her shoulder rested against his, her breathing steady in the hush of the cabin. Outside, frost lay thick on the earth, but inside the walls there was warmth, quiet, fragile, but real. And with each breath they shared, Calder knew that the line between solitude and companionship had been crossed. What began as survival was becoming something else entirely, something that felt like healing, something he could no longer deny. The wind still carried danger, the trail still threatened riders, but the cabin no longer stood as just his refuge. It was theirs now, shaped by her presence, softened by her laughter, and held together by the fragile strength of trust. And though neither spoke of it, both knew their story was moving toward a place where silence would no longer be enough. The land stretched wide and silent, the horizon pale beneath the late winter sun. Calder rode slow along the pasture line, the reins loose in his hand, the cold air biting his skin. Behind him, seated steady though still healing, Nia held lightly to his coat. Her fingers, once trembling, rested with quiet trust against the fabric, and her gaze scanned the distance with the same careful vigilance that had long been his alone. He found himself glancing back more often than he should, not because he feared she would fall, but because the sight of her there felt like a truth he had never thought to claim. When they returned to the cabin, she slid down from the horse with care, her bare feet still wrapped in cloth, though stronger now. She moved with new purpose, carrying the blanket to the fence rail, shaking out the dust with a sure rhythm. Calder watched as she straightened, hair loose against the wind, her movements no longer that of a stranger seeking shelter, but of a woman shaping her place in the world again. Something in him softened at the sight, and though he said nothing, his silence carried the weight of acknowledgment. Inside, the fire hummed low in the stove. She had already fed it before they left, leaving the cabin warm, the pot of beans simmering with quiet patience. They ate together at the small table, not speaking much, but every glance, every pass of the bread, carried ease instead of hesitation. Afterward, Calder cleaned his rifle while Naya sat cross-legged by the fire, mending the sleeve of his shirt. Her stitches were crooked still, but steadier, and when she held it up with a faint frown, he told her simply, "It'll hold." The way her lips curved at that answer settled into him deeper than any warmth the fire could give. Evenings became softer. She brushed out her hair by the firelight, long strands catching the glow until it seemed as though the cabin itself was brighter for her presence. Calder sat nearby, sharpening his knife, but his eyes drifted more often than his hands worked. She did not hide beneath the blanket now. Instead, she moved with ease, sometimes humming, sometimes watching him with eyes that no longer carried only fear. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, alive, layered with unspoken words neither of them needed to rush. At night, the cot became theirs in quiet acceptance. She no longer curled to the far edge, no longer left that breath of distance. Instead, she lay near enough that he felt the warmth of her body beneath the shared blanket. At first, his arm rested close, but not upon her, his breath careful, steady. Then, one night, she turned slightly, her hand brushing against his arm, light as wind. He did not move away. Instead, he let his arm drift across her waist, slow, cautious, ready to retreat. But she only shifted closer, her forehead brushing his chest, her breathing steady. The stillness of the cabin wrapped around them both, and Calder felt a kind of peace that war and solitude had long denied him. The days followed in gentle rhythm, the kind that carried the quiet of healing. Calder worked the fences, cut wood, rode the pastures. Nia tended the fire, kept the meals simple, mended what needed care. Yet it was not routine that bound them. It was the ease that grew in each shared glance, each unspoken promise. Sometimes when he returned from the cold, she was already there by the stove, her braid falling over her shoulder, her hands steady as she stirred the pot. The sight struck him every time with a quiet force, as though the cabin had at last found the life it had been waiting for. One evening, as twilight pressed soft against the windows, she sat brushing out her hair while Calder leaned against the table, his rifle across his lap. She looked at him then, her dark eyes steady, and asked quietly, "You fight for me?" The words held no doubt, only the need to hear the truth aloud. Calder met her gaze, the air thick with the weight of his answer. "I will." She closed her eyes for a moment, a breath of relief escaping her lips, and when she opened them again, there was something softer there, something that held more than survival. Later that night, When the fire burned low, she did not wait for silence to bridge the distance. She leaned toward him, her lips brushing his in a kiss as soft as the whisper of snow. Calder froze for the briefest moment, then lifted his hand to her cheek, rough palm tender against her skin. When she drew back, her breath quickened, her eyes searching his face, waiting for rejection. Instead, he kissed her again, slower, steadier, until she melted against him. When they finally lay back down, she curled against his chest without hesitation, her hand resting over his heart. The storm outside still howled across the plains, but within the cabin there was only warmth, only the healing sound of two hearts beating in rhythm. Calder lay awake longer than usual, not from vigilance, but from the simple desire to hold that moment. And as sleep finally pulled him under, he knew with certainty that the quiet life he had once guarded so fiercely was no longer his alone. It had become theirs, bound not by chance, but by choice, by trust, and by the first fragile bloom of love that had begun to root itself deep within the heart of winter. The days stretched longer as winter loosened its hold, and the rhythm between them deepened into something that felt both fragile and unshakable. Calder no longer woke to silence that gnawed at him. He woke to the quiet sound of Nia moving softly about the cabin, feeding the fire, setting water to boil. The air that once pressed against his chest with the weight of solitude now carried the warmth of her presence, subtle yet undeniable. When he rose, she would look up, her braid falling loose against her shoulder, and though her lips rarely curved into more than the faintest smile, it was enough to steady him in a way nothing else had in years. Her feet healed, the bruises fading until she could walk without flinching. She moved with assurance now, tending to the cabin not as a guest, but as though it had become her own. Calder noticed the small ways she claimed the space, the careful folding of blankets, the neat stacking of dishes, the way she swept dust from corners he had ignored. These quiet acts stitched themselves into the cabin like threads of permanence. He did not name it aloud, but in his heart he knew. This place no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to them. One morning, after they shared bread and coffee, he saddled the horse and gestured for her to join him. She hesitated only briefly before letting him lift her onto the saddle behind him. The pale sky stretched wide overhead as they rode through the pasture, the air sharp and clean, the sound of cattle low in the distance. Nia's hands rested lightly on the back of his coat, her touch feather-soft, yet grounding. She said little, but when she scanned the horizon with steady eyes, Calder felt the weight of watchfulness lighten, as though for the first time he was no longer the only one guarding the silence. Back at the cabin, she helped him unsaddle the horse, carrying the blanket to the fence rail with quiet assurance. Calder watched her, the wind tugging at her hair, and felt something inside him settle into place. She belonged here, not because he had offered her shelter, but because she had chosen it. That night, as firelight flickered over the walls, she sat near him on the cot, her knees drawn close, her gaze steady. When he asked if she planned to stay, her answer was simple: "If can." Those two words rooted in him deeper than any vow, and without hesitation he told her, "Then you stay." From that moment, the air between them changed. She no longer waited for permission to draw near. When she rested her head against his shoulder, he stilled, then let the weight of her presence sink into him like warmth after long cold. He had spent years keeping his distance from the world, building walls of silence and steel around himself. But with her leaning into him, those walls felt less like protection and more like a cage he no longer wished to carry. Nights softened further. They lay on the cot together, no longer divided by space or caution. At first, their closeness was quiet, the brush of her forehead against his chest, his arm resting across her waist. But soon it became more, a kiss shared in the dim light, unhurried, steady, carrying the taste of smoke and fire-warmed air. When she pulled back, her breath quick and eyes uncertain, he answered with another kiss, slower, sure, until her tension melted. They did not speak of love, but it lived in the silence between them, in every glance and every breath they shared. The cabin became a haven, yet shadows still pressed at its edges. Tracks appeared on the trail one morning, riders passing near enough to stir unease. Calder crouched by the prince, jaw tight, knowing danger had not passed them by. When he returned to the cabin and told her, Nia did not shrink back. Instead, she gripped the rifle he set near her chair with steady hands, her braid tight, her face calm. "I stay," she said simply, and in her voice there was no fear, only resolve. That night, when they lay close beneath the blanket, there was no hesitation in her touch. She pressed against him, not only for warmth, but for certainty, for the assurance that together they could withstand whatever shadows came down the trail. Calder held her with both arms, his hand tracing the braid down her back, and whispered words he had never thought he would speak again. Promises unspoken, vows sealed, not in ceremony, but in the steady rhythm of two hearts beating in the dark. Sleep came slower, but when it did, it was deeper than any rest he had known since the war. The storm outside raged, but inside the cabin there was calm, the healing kind that came not from solitude, but from love that had found its root in the unlikeliest of places. And as dawn approached, Calder knew with certainty that the life he had once lived in silence had ended. What stretched before them was no longer his burden alone, but theirs, bound by trust, by choice, and by a warmth that would carry them into whatever trials the horizon might bring. The trail brought shadows sooner than either of them wished. One morning, while frost still glazed the troughs and cattle huddled against the fence line, Calder spotted movement on the horizon, two riders, their outlines dark against the pale sky. His gut tightened, every instinct sharpening, but he kept his face steady when he stepped back into the cabin. Nia looked up at once, reading the truth in his silence. She set aside the mending in her lap, her fingers brushing the rifle at her side without a word. Calder told her calmly to stay inside, bar the door, and not open it unless it was his voice she heard. She obeyed, though her eyes lingered on him with a weight that felt like a promise unspoken. When the riders came into the yard, Calder stood on the porch, rifle across his arm. The older one greeted him with false warmth, asking after a girl they claimed had stolen something. Calder's jaw tightened, his voice flat as he answered, "No one here but him." Their eyes told him they didn't believe it, but his rifle made clear he meant to hold his ground. They pressed, but he refused. Finally, with a spit in the dirt and a promise it wasn't finished, they rode off slow, leaving silence behind, heavy as the frost. Inside, Nia was waiting in the middle of the room, her hands clenched, though her eyes were steady. "They go?" she asked, and he nodded. She stepped close then, so close he could feel the heat of her breath when she whispered, "I fight too." Her voice carried no tremor. Calder studied her, the firelight touching the determination in her face, and nodded once. In that moment, she was no longer just a woman he had given shelter. She was his equal in resolve, his partner in whatever storm was coming. From then on, the days carried a new tension. Calder checked the rifle, cleaned every round of ammunition, stacked wood higher near the cabin. Naya moved with equal purpose, sharpening the kitchen knife until it gleamed, tying her hair back, her braid firm as her resolve. Yet, amid this readiness, warmth threaded between them stronger than before. At night she pressed closer when they lay down, no hesitation in her touch. Her forehead rested against his chest, her hand curled lightly over his heart, and Calder held her as though by doing so he could shield her from every shadow. Sleep came slow, but when it did, it was steady, dreamless, the kind that healed more than weariness. When the riders returned days later, dust rising behind them, Calder did not greet them with words. He levelled his rifle steady as stone, warning with silence sharper than steel. They threatened, pressed, but his answer did not waver. "She stays." Nia stood inside with the spare rifle, hidden but ready, her hands steady, her breath even. When at last the men turned back, their curses trailing with them, Calder stepped inside to find her waiting. She set down the rifle and crossed the room in 2 strides, cupping his face in both hands before kissing him with urgency born of fear and relief entwined. The kiss was fire and balm both, carrying every unsaid truth between them. Calder let the rifle slip from his hand, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her close. There was no distance left, no silence wide enough to separate them now. When they finally parted, her breath trembled against his skin, but her eyes were steady, fierce with certainty. "They come back," she whispered, and he answered with the quiet strength of a man who had already chosen. "We stay ready." That night, the cabin glowed with more than firelight. Nia climbed into the cot before he had even removed his boots, holding the blanket open in wordless invitation. He joined her, lying on his side, facing her in the quiet glow. For a long moment they simply looked at one another, the weight of danger still pressing from outside, but softened by the healing warmth between them. Calder traced his rough fingers along her cheek, down the curve of her arm, and when she leaned into his touch, he kissed her again, slower, deeper, unhurried, as though they had all the time the world had once denied them. The storm outside rattled the shutters, but inside there was only the sound of their hearts finding rhythm together, steady and sure. What began as intrusion had become belonging, and what began as survival had become love, quiet, fierce, and unbreakable. The horizon still threatened, but neither of them stood alone now. Whatever came, they would face it not as strangers, but as 2 souls bound by choice, by trust, and by a healing warmth that turned even the coldest night into sanctuary. The wind shifted with the promise of change, carrying not only the scent of pine and dust, but also the weight of something ending, something beginning. The riders returned once more, 3 this time, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the pale horizon. Calder stood on the porch with his rifle steady, the old war-born tension humming through him. Yet beneath it beat something stronger, the vow he had made to the woman waiting inside. Nia did not hide. She stood just beyond the door, her rifle clutched in steady hands, her braid tight, her gaze unshaken. The air between them carried more than fear. It carried resolve, the healing certainty of two souls bound together. The standoff stretched like a drawn bow. Demands came, harsh and cold, but Calder's answer did not waver. She stays. The older rider spat his threats, his eyes burning with promises of trouble. But when Calder's rifle barked into the dirt near their boots, the sharp echo cracked the tension wide open. Silence followed. Then, slowly, the riders withdrew, their curses swallowed by the wide plain. Calder kept his aim until they were specks against the fading light, and only then did he lower the rifle, his breath leaving him in a rush he hadn't known he held. When he stepped inside, Naya was there waiting, her hands steady but her eyes wide with the weight of everything unspoken. She set her rifle aside and crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his middle with a force that carried all the fear, relief and love she hadn't voiced. Calder froze only a moment before he let out a long breath, resting his hand on the back of her head, pulling her closer. The cabin, once a place of silence and solitude, now pulsed with the warmth of something unbreakable. That night there was no hesitation. They lay together on the cot, the fire humming low, the world outside falling quiet. Her hand rested on his chest, his arm held her close, and when their lips met again, it was not with urgency, but with the tender assurance of love finally given room to bloom. The healing was in the unhurried rhythm of their touch, in the way her breath steadied against his, in the way his rough hands moved with unexpected gentleness. Outside, the wind stilled, but inside, two hearts found their sanctuary. The days that followed carried no promise of safety. Calder knew shadows lingered on the horizon, but the cabin no longer stood as a fortress for one. It had become a home, a place shaped by her quiet order and his steady presence, bound by shared labor and laughter that began to appear like small bursts of sunlight. Nia moved through the rooms with ease, humming as she worked, her voice threading through the air like balm. Calder found himself pausing just to watch her, realizing the silence that once consumed him was now filled with life. One evening, as the sun bled into gold and the sky stretched wide with stars, they sat together on the porch. Calder's arm rested around her shoulders, her head leaned against his chest, and the land before them glowed as though it had been remade. "This your home now?" he asked, voice low. She lifted her gaze to the horizon, then to him, and answered simply, "Yes, home." That single word carried more weight than any vow, more healing than any promise, for it bound not only her to the land, but her to him. Later, when the fire burned low and the night curled quiet around the cabin, Calder kissed her slow, tender, reverent. She kissed him back with the certainty of someone who had chosen, not merely survived. They lay together, breathing as one, and the cabin that had once echoed with emptiness now throbbed with the warmth of belonging. Morning came clear, the air crisp, the sky endless. Calder stood with coffee in hand, watching the first light touch the horizon. Beside him, barefoot with a blanket around her shoulders, Nia stepped out to join him. They did not need words. The healing lay in the silence they shared, in the way their shoulders touched, in the way the world stretched before them, open, endless, theirs. For the first time in years, Calder Boone did not think of loss or war. He thought only of the woman beside him, the home they had built from ashes, and the love that had come quietly, fiercely to claim them both. And if this story warmed your heart, if it left you with even a touch of peace and healing, I invite you to let me know. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so we can walk together through more tales where love blooms like firelight against the cold. Your voice keeps these stories alive, and together we can carry the warmth further.